Hello sewing friends and welcome back. Today we are making a petticoat because I should say we are making specifically a 50s style petticoat because recently I was making a lovely night and day dress, one of Gertie's charm patterns and it had a beautiful circle skirt, and I realised I would really like to make it nice and floofy and give it that really lovely 50s big voluminous skirt look. So I wanted a petticoat, but I didn't have the material for a traditional petticoat, nor did I have a pattern for it. But I realised that I had this huge, like 4 meters of a net applique fabric that I didn't like at all when I originally bought it. This was one, if you remember, when I made the dress. Did I film that? I don't think I did film that when I made the dress for my engagement party. Initially I had bought this like net applique fabric and I received it in mail, realised that the applique print or design was actually much bigger than I thought, so I really didn't like it at all. So I put it aside and I bought different lace fabric for that dress, and I still had my net fabric sitting around when I decided to make a petticoat, so I used that instead. So this is definitely not it's not a proper petticoat. This is essentially what I've made is a circle skirt with some frills down the bottom, but it works for exactly the purpose that I wanted it to work for. It looks great under dresses and I'm very happy with it, and it probably took me a couple of hours to make all in all. So I wanted to share with you all how I got around to doing this because it's very simple, and I think this is a great demonstration of the fact that if you just have an idea in your head, it doesn't matter if it matches with what you're supposed to do, just go and make it and make it work. That's what this project was. This was me realizing that I had no proper undergarments for the look that I wanted, so I made it work, and I wanted to share with you all how I went about that. So if you'd like to see how I winged a petticoat, so maybe you can wing your own, or just are curious in what I did, keep watching, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Let's get going. So getting started with my insane amount of net, as I mentioned before, I used a circle skirt pattern for the basis of my skirt. I knew that this pattern fit really well and would go well under most of my dresses, as the majority of them who need the extra proof I think are pretty much all circle skirts. If you use a petticoat under it, it's generally a circle skirt. So I thought this would be a good starting point. Plus it was a pattern that I already had and didn't need to make any alterations to, so win-win. So cut out my circle skirt pieces just as usual, and then I went through and basically cut just really long strips of fabric using the remainder of my fabric. I think I made them about 10 inches wide and then just as long as they could possibly be. And as you can see, I'm just going through and cutting my 10-inch strips, and I'm cutting 4 of them. These are going to later be joined together to make 2 separate really long strips of fabric that will create my ruffles for the base of my skirt. Now, I will say, typically when you're making a petticoat, you would probably have a lot more ruffles going on and a lot more layers. I am working with a net fabric with an applique on it instead of just a plain net or something much lighter. So my fabric is actually pretty hefty. And I'm really happy with the end result and how voluminous it is, so I didn't feel the need to do additional layers here. If I did, I would probably add layers of a different fabric so that I wasn't adding to the weight of it, because as it currently stands, it's a pretty hefty piece of fabric, piece of clothing. I also cut my waistband from the same fabric. To get the length of my waistband, I measured my waist, and then I added 1.25 inches to that length for my seam allowance. And I wanted my waistband to be roughly 1 inch wide when it was finished, so I cut it out to be 3¼ inches wide. So that accounts for 2 inches of width on both sides once it's folded over. And then also my seam allowance, again as a standard 5/8 of an inch. And then I started sewing. So I started off with my ruffles, and I'm basically taking those 4 long pieces of ruffling material, and I'm joining them together at the short ends so that I will end up with 2 long pieces of ruffling material. And I'm actually sewing these with a French seam. So what that means is that I'm going to sew them wrong sides together initially, and then I'm going to trim the seam allowance, press them flat, and then basically flip them so that they're right sides together, and I'm going to sew them again. And so the first time I sew them when they're wrong sides together, I'm going to sew them at 3/8 of an inch. And then the second time around, I'm going to sew them at 1/4 of an inch. And this will mean that my raw edges are completely enclosed in my seam, and I don't have to worry about any fraying, which I really wanted to do because this is a net, and to be honest, I really wasn't sure how it would handle washing. I'm doing the same thing for my skirt pieces as well. So with my circle skirt, I've basically got 1 really large front piece and 2 back pieces, and at the side seams I'm sewing them again with French seams, just again sewing them wrong sides together, trimming that seam allowance down, and then sewing them right sides together for the final time to enclose those raw edges. So overall, the construction of this is really, really very simple. The base of it is a circle skirt, which is very easy to construct and a very easy pattern to develop as well. There are tons of instructions online about how to develop your own circle skirt pattern, so it's quite easy to achieve if that's something that you're interested in. And then it's really long pieces of gathered material that form the base for my ruffles. So as I mentioned, I did press my seams between my initial run with wrong sides together and then going through again with the right sides together, but I feel it's always important to remind people to press their seams because they are something that it's a very simple step that makes a garment look quite polished. And particularly when I work with French seams, I think French seams might work really great for delicate and very fine fabrics, but I do think they're a little bit bulky for standard fabrics. So I like to go through and give them a really, really good press whenever I work with them, because otherwise I think they just end up looking a bit bulky and they stick out a bit, which is frustrating sometimes. So once I've gone through and given everything a really good press, I'm actually going to hem my ruffles now. So I decided to do this first because they are currently, well, I say ruffles, currently they are still really, really, really long strips of fabric, which took me forever to hem. I wanted to do it now before they were ruffled because it was going to be much easier, albeit take a very long time. And of course I decided to do a rolled hem because, again, I didn't want these to be fraying and I wanted the majority of my seams to be enclosed in on themselves. So I decided to do a rolled hem, which was a trick and a half because I was rolling it with my fingers as I went through because I don't currently have a rolled hem foot. So this did take quite a bit of time, but I think was quite worth it. So I went through, I did this for the strips of fabric that are going to form my ruffles, and I also did this for the hem of my circle skirt. And fun fact, going through this footage and cutting it, I am fairly certain that the majority of my footage was just me trying to hem these giant strips of fabric. And I know what you're thinking, wow, cats, where did they come from? This is a sewing video. But no, as regular viewers of the catsews may know, cats are pretty usual in my videos. I like to include a little sneak peek of my cats at some point in the video. They were just being super cute and grooming themselves in the sun, and oh, she's enjoying it so much and they're so sweet. So please enjoy this small cat break. So just before I started gathering up my ruffles, I decided to measure my skirt length at the points where I wanted the ruffles to hit to figure out how long the tops of the ruffles should be. So I wanted the hem of my bottom ruffle to sit just above the hem of my skirt, and I wanted the hem of my top ruffle to hit about halfway down my bottom ruffle. So from that I kind of figured out approximately where they should sit on the skirt and then how long they should be. And then I stuck them under the machine. So whenever I am gathering something, I set my stitch length to the longest it can go. And then I just basically let the fabric and the machine do its thing. I did stitch my gathering thread at 5/8 of an inch, so my standard seam allowance length. Sometimes when I'm trying to do tight gathers, I will also hold my finger just behind the presser foot and kind of hold the fabric down, and that helps it to gather up. I didn't do this time, mostly because I was just focusing on trying to get through the fabric as efficiently as possible, but that is also a trick that I find useful at times. The other tip I suppose I should note here is I do see other sewers talk about skipping seams when you're gathering. Personally, that just seems a bit annoying to me, and I haven't really had any issues going over seams with gathering thread, though I can see why it might bunch up a little bit and become an issue, so just something to be aware of, but wasn't a problem for me. The other thing to note as well is that quite a lot I see people doing two gathering threads, so kind of one about 1/4 of an inch away from the other one. I think this helps to have a backup thread just in case your first one snaps, and B, I'm pretty sure it might also help to make gathers a bit more even, though I can't really support that one. I personally don't do this, particularly when it's a really large area I have to gather, which may seem counterintuitive, because certainly a larger area to gather may mean you have more chance of your thread breaking. Overall, I just go slowly and I try to be mindful of the thread and not pulling on it too much if I hit a tough spot. So I get on very well with the single thread, but if you are experiencing a lot of breaking when you're trying to gather fabrics, potentially looking at skipping your seams and having a few different gathering threads running through, and also possibly looking at doing 2 separate gathering threads might be quite helpful for you. So once my fabric was all gathered up, I start working to gather it down to the correct length. I kept measuring the edges, well, the area of my skirt that it needed to go across and my fabric. It took a really long time to gather this down, and particularly my top ruffle ended up being very tightly gathered by the time I was finished it. But also the good thing about gathers is that you can easily gather them up some more or let some out if it's not quite the right length. So there is quite a bit of flexibility here. And then I just went through and pinned it to my skirt. As made sense to me, I am starting off with my bottom ruffle. I'm going to sew this one down first, and then I will move to the top one. That way just fabric isn't getting in other fabric's way, and it makes it a bit easier for me to see what I'm doing. Now, this top edge of the ruffles was a raw edge that I didn't think about too much when I was initially hemming everything, so these are completely raw. And as I'm sewing over it, I'm just sewing over the initial gathering stitch as well. So when I finished gathering them, I tied my threads into in a knot at the end, and then I cut the excess off. Particularly with these really long pieces of fabric, you end up with quite a bit of excess. So part of the reason I'm sewing over my gathering thread is to give it that extra bit of stability, to make sure nothing really unravels, and just to give it an extra bit of backup, really. But yes, these gathered pieces, the very top raw edge is completely raw. I didn't think about that at the time. I possibly should have, but after wearing it quite a few times and having this as a hand wash only garment, because it is net, and it is very heavily gathered, so not really something I want to chuck in the machine just in case something does break, because that would be a huge pain in the butt. This is holding up pretty well overall, so my fears about the net unraveling were a bit unfounded. Once I finished sewing on my bottom ruffle, I then switched and did the exact same thing to my top ruffle. And then when that was all done, I could start with my waistband. So I initially started this right sides together, just sewing along the top edge of my skirt and the bottom edge of my waistband at the standard 5/8 of an inch. At the start and the end of my waistband at the short edges, I've already folded in my seam allowance just to make things a bit easier for myself, because to be honest, I find those ends of waistbands kind of difficult to sew together. So I find this method of just folding in the raw edge, and then when it folds over long ways, it's all enclosed. I find that to be much easier. And once I had sewed the first edge of my waistband down, I gave everything a good press. Of course, I feel like we should have a bingo game for how many times I say gave it a good press in a video. But I pressed all of the raw seam allowances up into the waistband. And then I folded the seam allowance along the top edge of my waistband down, gave that a press. That way when I fold my waistband down and in half, and stitch it, all of my raw edges will once again be nicely enclosed. So ordinarily when I would go to stitch the final raw edge of a waistband down, I would do it from the top side and stitch in the ditch basically. So stitch along the line that's already been created by the first edge of your waistband that you sewed down on the right side of the fabric. However, this fabric was a little bit movie and didn't want to cooperate very well, and also being that this is an undergarment, I just went and sewed it through from the wrong side. That way I could control the edge of the waistband a little bit better, because I've definitely had some of those instances where you think you've sewn everything so nicely down, and then it turns out something, the raw edge has flipped out from under the waistband somehow, and not gotten caught in along the stitch line. So I didn't want that to happen with this, and I just wanted everything to be nice and easy to deal with, and I wasn't too fussed about the final finish of this garment because it does go underneath everything. So I just sewed from the wrong side. And then to finish this project off, I am sewing a hook and bar closure onto the edges of the waistband. I did purposely make my waistband a little bit longer. That way, just by unpicking the bar closure and moving it along the skirt, I can very easily adjust how this petticoat fits. You'll also notice that this is the only closure point, so the top of my back seam does not actually close fully. It is mostly open, so obviously I can step into this petticoat, and then it's just this hook and bar closure at the top that actually makes it fit my body. I am actually very happy with how this works, and again means that the fit is quite adjustable for later on if my size changes at all. So I've just gone through and hand stitched this hook and bar. Also, the reason I chose a hook and bar is it's a little bit more stable than a hook and eye. Someone else in a video recommended using these instead of hooks and eyes, and I have to say I wholeheartedly agree with them. This was a lot more stable and a little bit easier to sew as well. So yes, I recommend using these instead. And then we're done. Thank you all for watching. I hope that was useful or perhaps interesting for you. If you enjoyed it, give this video a like and leave a comment down below. Because come talk to me, share me your own sewing experiences. Actually, what is something that you've made recently just on a whim with no pattern or much forethought at all, and how well did it work out? I'd be very interested to hear. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I've already said all that. Goodbye sewing friends, happy sewing.